Historical mysteries may date back to ancient or even prehistoric times. Historical periods where finding the answer based on writing alone would be impossible. Others are more recent, but that doesn't always mean they're easier to solve. One thing they all have in common is just how fascinating solving these mysteries can be. In 1737, the Royal Navy warship HMS Victory was launched, and she would become the flagship of two celebrated English admirals, but sank in October of 1744 under mysterious circumstances. The location of the wreck of the Victory was one of the greatest mysteries in naval history and was solved in 2009. The Victory was under the command of Sir John Balcon when she vanished without a trace with all hands. The ship had led a fleet to relieve a convoy of British ships that were being blockaded by the French in a Portuguese river. The mission was successful, and Victory was on its way home when disaster struck. The ship was separated from the rest of the fleet, somewhere near the Channel Islands, and it sank. Later, some wreckage washed ashore on the beaches of some islands, and it was assumed that the ship was somewhere nearby. The caskets and Guernsey were believed to be the site of the sinking. Blame was placed on Balcon and the sailors, who were accused of poor navigation. People also blamed the lighthouse keeper on the island, assuming that he hadn't done his job properly and the ship had crashed onto the rocks. But centuries later, when underwater searches for the ship took place there was no sign of the vessel. In 2009, a Florida-based company, Odyssey Marine Exploration, began the search. They would eventually find the shipwreck 100 kilometers away. The Victory had sunk in deep waters with nothing nearby that it could have collided with. Instead, the sinking was based on a storm which had caused the vessel to turn over. The company located bronze cannons on the sea floor, which were used to identify the wreck. Soon after the sinking of the Victory, the Royal Navy switched to iron cannons, and the ship was the last Royal Navy warship to sink with a complete complement of bronze cannons. Further analysis of the wreck showed that there was more human error involved in the sinking than was first thought, but it wasn't the fault of anyone on board. The ship was made of sub-quality timber, a problem that the Navy was aware of at the time. That made it even more vulnerable to the storm that ultimately caused its sinking. The Victory still lies on the seabed, 70 meters below the ocean surface. In ancient Rome, purple was known as a noble color. This was due to just how rare purple dye was. Natural purple pigments could only be created by a few insects and flowers. It wasn't until modern times and the invention of synthetic purples that the color became more common. But thousands of years ago, the ancient Chinese created their own purple pigment, Hen Purple. Not only was it a purple pigment, but it was also synthetically created. How this was done remained a mystery until the 1990s. Today, more secrets of the mysterious Hen Purple are still being discovered. The purple pigment first appeared around 800 BC. For some reason, it wasn't until the Qin dynasty, in 221 BC, that the pigment started to be used in art. Its first major use came with the famous terracotta army, which was buried with the first Qin emperor. For about 400 years, Hen Purple was used in art and ceramics, but fell out of use around the year 220. Over time, the knowledge of how this pigment was even made was lost. Hen Purple fascinated researchers who came across the pigment while examining items from ancient China. The pigment is unstable, which means that unfortunately much of the artwork painted with the pigment has been damaged. That made learning about its properties even more difficult. But analysis of the chemical makeup of the paint revealed that it's a barium-copper silicate mix. This is very similar to the chemicals that make up Egyptian blue, which is found around the Mediterranean and near the Middle East. But Egyptian blue uses calcium instead of barium. The barium added to the mix meant that Hen Purple would need to be heated to a much higher temperature to be produced. At first, historians thought knowledge of Egyptian blue had traveled up the Silk Road, but later a new theory was put forward. The ingredients for making Hen Purple are the same found in many ancient Chinese glassworks. Barium makes glass cloudy, which would have resembled white jade. The pigment was simply a byproduct of this glass-making process. During the Second World War, about 20% of all US submarines that went out on patrol never returned. Some would later be found on the sea floor, but the final resting place of many submarines and their crew were never found. In 2023, a historical maritime mystery was solved when divers finally located one of the most formidable submarines of the war. The USS Albacore was a Gato-class submarine that was first launched in February of 1942. She had a total of 10 patrols over the next 3 years, focusing on the Pacific Ocean. Like many crews of many US submarines during the war, the sailors' main job was to attack the Japanese military and merchant ships to try to cut off their supply lines. It was a job that the crew of the Albacore were very successful at. During the boat's patrols, it managed to sink at least 10 enemy ships. Among these was the Japanese light cruiser Tenryu, only the second Japanese cruiser to be sunk by a US submarine. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the submarine fired 3 torpedoes, one of which struck the aircraft carrier Taiho. The damage was significant and directly led to the ship sinking 6.5 hours later. But this was to be the last glory of the Albacore. After returning to base and command being transferred to Lieutenant Commander Hugh Rimmer, the submarine set out on its 11th and final patrol on October 3rd of 1944. The last time anybody heard from the submarine was a few weeks later, when she stopped at Midway to refuel. One of the targets of the patrol was to monitor shipping through the Tsugaru Strait between the Japanese islands of Hokkaido and Honshu. She'd been told to not go into the strait, as it was suspected that the entire area was mined. Whether or not this was where she went down was a mystery. After the war, Japanese files seemed to confirm the submarine had hit a mine somewhere in the region, but the vessel could not be found. In May of 2022, a team from the University of Tokyo began searching for the submarine. The team used sonar and remotely operated underwater vehicles to search an area off of Hokkaido. They spotted what appeared to be a pillar, but upon closer inspection, it was the periscope of a submarine. Images from the submersibles showed more details of the submarine, which investigators were able to line up with work and modifications the Albacore had done. In February of 2023, the Naval History and Heritage Command confirmed the wreck was of the Albacore, and this mystery was finally solved. The Saracens Giant is an enormous hill figure carved into a hill in Dorset, England. For centuries, historians have been puzzled about when this mysterious figure was created and why. New research and excavations managed to solve both historical mysteries, revealing a surprising answer. The figure was made by digging shallow trenches into the soil and then filling those in with chalk. The giant is shown without clothing or hair and holds a club in one hand. Historians believed it was a depiction of the Roman hero Hercules, or possibly an even older prehistoric deity. Hercules was often depicted with a club. What they couldn't determine was when the figure was created. 2 main theories were put forward. One was during the Roman Britain era, which would be the most obvious time for a Roman hero to be carved into the earth. The other was that it was created during the 17th century, when Oliver Cromwell ruled the country. Cromwell was referred to as England's Hercules, and the giant could have been made to mock him. But when archaeologists dug into the mystery, they discovered neither was true. Analyzing snail shells found at the site revealed that it had been made in the medieval period, or later. Further analysis showed it was actually created during the Anglo-Saxon period, sometime between 700 and 1100. During the 9th century, there was renewed interest in Hercules, which might explain why people of that time created the image. By looking at texts from the time, historians were also able to solve the mystery of the purpose of the figure. When it was carved, there were many important roads located near Giant Hill, including an army road that led to the hill. Fresh water and supplies could also be found nearby. Researchers determined that this was likely an army mustering point, created during a time when Viking raids on the coast of England were common. But they were also able to figure out more of the story. Centuries later, an abbey was built at the base of the hill. The monks there reinterpreted the Saracens Giant as being their patron saint, Eadwald, and created a story of him planting a staff at the top of the hill. The reinvention was designed to help the abbey gain some of the saint's relic. In 1938, a well that once supplied drinking water to a medieval castle was drained. The workers found a disturbing discovery at the bottom. A human skeleton was found under a pile of rocks. Research has linked the man to an old saga and sheds light on the so-called Wellman. In the 1100s, Sviresborg Castle was built in central Norway. It became a fortress for Sverre Sigurdsson during the Heklands War, a war between the claimants for the throne of Norway. The ruins of the castle still exist today, with a well within the castle walls. Sverre lived until 1202, but during his life a biography was written in the form of a king's saga. The Sverre saga tells many tales of Sverre's life, including a raid on a Sviresborg castle by enemy Bagler forces. According to the saga, the Baglers managed to break into the castle and took everything of value. Even the homes located inside the castle walls were burned down. Even though they didn't harm the people living there, they left behind something that may have been intended to cause even more damage. The saga records the body of a man being thrown down the well and covered in rocks. Sverre was away from the castle at the time, and it was believed that this was someone closely connected to him. It may have been meant to send a message to the king. Alternatively, some believe it may have been an attempt to poison the water in the well. Centuries later, the well was drained and the skeleton of a human was uncovered. Even at the time, this was linked to the story in the saga, but it was impossible to know for certain. At the time, researchers didn't have the technology to accurately date the remains and solve the mystery of who this person was. New research has allowed those answers to be revealed. By analyzing DNA from the Wellman's tooth, scientists determined that the individual had been between 30 and 40 years old when he passed away. He also passed away roughly 900 years ago, right around the time when the raid took place. The most interesting detail scientists discovered concerned where the man originated. By comparing the DNA to other samples, they determined he'd come from Norway's southernmost county. This meant he was most likely part of the Bagler raiding force, rather than a defender. The Bagler had thrown one of their own down the well. The one mystery scientists couldn't solve was why. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was an ancient battle that shaped the future of Europe and had a lasting impact up to modern day. For centuries after the Roman Empire, knowledge of the battle was lost. Even when ancient writing about the battle was rediscovered, the location remained a mystery until the late 1980s. The battle was fought in the year 9 CE, only a few decades after Augustus had taken control of the Roman Empire. By then, the empire surrounded the Mediterranean Ocean and reached up to the Netherlands, but the Rhine River marked a boundary to the northeast. Beyond that, the Romans hadn't been able to conquer the Germanic tribes. There was a constant push to grow the empire, and Roman leaders underestimated the Germans. The tribes in the region had complex farming systems, organized military units, and were able to communicate over long distances. They also had people with a good knowledge of the way Romans fought. Many Germanic people had been brought into the Roman army to help the Romans fight the so-called barbarians. One of these was a man the Romans called Arminius, who was a very capable soldier. Arminius had been awarded the rank of knight and made a citizen of the empire, but his allegiance was first to the Karashi tribe. In the year 9, Augustus sent legions of men to investigate reports of uprising among tribes. Arminius led the Romans into a trap. By bringing the army through a narrow pass between bogland and the hills, the army was stretched thin and couldn't get into formation. German warriors attacked and were quickly able to overrun the Romans. Very few escaped. A British amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun was stationed in the region of Osnabrück later on in 1987 and took a metal detector out to some fields near the village of Kalkrisa. He hoped to find a few coins or small Roman artifacts, but the number of coins, buckles, and tools that he located indicated that a larger cluster of people had once been here and had apparently tried to flee. Historians were able to conclude that this was the site of the ancient battle, finally solving the mystery. Maria del Carmen is an opera by the Spanish composer Enrique Granados. He believed it was his best opera, but after an initial string of performances, the opera faded into obscurity and was apparently lost. But in 2009, over a century after its first performance, the mystery of the opera was solved. Maria del Carmen premiered in 1898 in Madrid and was loved by critics and the audience. The performance was enjoyed so much that the Queen awarded Granados the Charles III Cross. Its second series of performances were less well received. Revisions were made, but the opera wouldn't reach the same level as the attention of Granados' other works. Granados kept the original score. It was unpublished, but he hoped it would be performed again. In 1916, the New York Metropolitan Opera was performing Granados' more famous opera, Goyescas. He and his wife traveled to the US to see the performance. Granados took with him the score for Maria del Carmen, hoping to convince the opera there to perform his piece. They declined, and Granados started his journey back to Spain. Unfortunately, the couple missed their direct ship back and had to return via England. As they crossed the English Channel, their ship was hit by a German U-boat, and both Granados and his wife lost their lives. The score survived and was passed on to the couple's children, but there was some debate over what to do with it and the other works. During the Spanish Civil War, the family fell into hard times, and one of Granados' sons sold the opera and 3 other pieces of work to the New York publisher Nathaniel Shipwrecked. But the rest of the family was unhappy and refused to give permission for any performances for publication. It seemed that the original Maria del Carmen would never see the stage again. Disaster struck again when the warehouse where the score was being kept caught fire in 1970. It was believed that the score was destroyed and the opera was completely lost. This wasn't the case, though. A biographer researching Enrique Granados managed to track down the last known location of the lost play and contacted Shilkret's family. There hadn't been a proper inventory after the fire, and it was possible that the opera had survived. After some digging, they discovered that the score was still mostly intact, though there was some fire and water damage. The work was restored and published in 2009. Performances took place in Spain and the US, bringing this lost opera back from obscurity. For centuries, the mystery of the origin of the Druze people has fascinated historians, linguists, and geneticists. Modern DNA technology has solved this mystery and shone a light on the history of this group. There are about 1 million Druze people alive today. Druze also describes a religion, which is a mix of the Abrahamic faiths and Hinduism, and is closed off to outsiders due to persecution in the past. Today, the Druze people live mostly in the mountains of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and marriage within the community is favored. While this is where the people live today, many have suspected their origin lies elsewhere. It was thought that they were unique from their neighbors, and not just due to their faith. Over the years, different theories have been put forward. Connections to various cultures in the Near and Middle East were suggested. Some even thought the Druze might have come from France and were descendants of a lost army from the Crusades. In 2016, a new study claimed to have solved the mystery. Scientists used geographic population structure to find the answer. The method looks at DNA samples from modern and ancient times to tell the story of the changes in geographic location over time. According to the study, the ancient Druze people originated in the mountainous region that spreads between Turkey, northern Iraq, and southern Armenia, and the Zagros mountain belt. The study compared the DNA of the modern Druze people to that of the remains of individuals from the Levant, Turkey, and Armenia, who passed away thousands of years ago. The region where the Druze originate, according to the study, has a long history of conflict and of different cultures meeting one another. The study suggests that it was one of these conflicts that caused the Druze people to relocate. When the Seljuk Turks moved south to the Levant to fight the Crusades, the Druze people also moved. They may have also fought in the Crusades. The study claims to have solved the mystery, but more studies are still taking place. For some, this may still be an unsolved mystery. When Queen Elizabeth I passed away in 1603, it brought an end to the Tudor period. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, and King James VI of Scotland was made King of England. But the reason why Elizabeth passed away at the age of 69 has remained a mystery. Before she passed, Elizabeth expressed that she didn't want a post-mortem. There would be no examination of her remains, so historians only have eyewitness accounts of the Queen in her final days to determine what actually happened to her. In 2023, as part of a Sky History show, Home Office pathologist Brett Lockyer and Professor Alice Roberts claimed to solve the mystery. In the centuries since she passed, a few possible causes were suggested. Elizabeth famously wore heavy white makeup. It was an effort to make her look more youthful, which was thought to grant her more power. A significant ingredient in that component was lead, and the makeup was actually categorized as a poison about 30 years after Elizabeth passed. There were signs that she was suffering from lead poisoning. She lost her hair and teeth, which had led to more significant problems, and it was theorized that this had ultimately led to her passing. Either the lead poisoning directly caused it, or the effects of the lead had allowed bacteria to enter her body, but experts thought there were other signs. Elizabeth was very weak and frail at the end of her life. She would stand in her bedchambers for 15 hours before collapsing because she didn't want to lie down. She thought if she lay down that she wouldn't be able to get back up. She also had swelling on her left hand, which meant that her coronation ring actually had to be cut off. Some believe that this is what ultimately caused her passing, as the constriction on her finger may have led to sepsis. But by looking at historical documents, the experts concluded that Elizabeth had actually been suffering from pneumonia. Her symptoms indicated that there was fluid in her lungs. Combined with strain on her heart, it ultimately caused her passing. But some have cast doubts on this conclusion, and this may be one of those mysteries that can never be solved. On a January night in 1700, people in villages along Japan's east coast woke up to find seawater flooding their homes. They rushed to higher ground as multiple walls of water rushed in from the ocean. The event was confusing and remained an unsolved mystery for over 300 years. The villagers knew about tsunamis. Living on the Pacific Ring of Fire, many had experienced earthquakes and the surge of water that comes with them when they happen out at sea. What was so strange on this occasion was that there was no earthquake. Records from the time period include writing from a village mayor who questioned how this could have happened without the earthquake. The tsunami was called an Orphan Tsunami and remained unexplained. In the 1980s, scientists in the US began trying to figure out how much damage a tsunami would cause if an earthquake struck off the west coast of the country. From Vancouver, Canada to Northern California, the edge of the North American plate doesn't meet with the Pacific plate. Between the two much larger plates is the Juan de Fuca plate. This plate is being pushed under the North American plate, creating the Cascadia subduction zone. Back then, scientists didn't think a magnitude 9 earthquake was possible in the region. Oral histories told by Native Americans and First Nations people from the region told of a massive quake and tsunami happening at some point in history, which claimed many lives, but this seemed unbelievable. There was some geological evidence that something significant had happened, though. By analyzing rocks in the region and ghost forests in Oregon and Washington, it was clear a major quake had definitely occurred. The ghost forests are formed from trees that were suddenly submerged in salt water and couldn't survive. This happened when the land suddenly fell several meters before the tsunami's waters rushed over them. Dating the earthquake was difficult. Geological evidence put it between 1640 and 1720. Tree ring analysis allowed scientists to narrow it down to the winter of 1699 to 1700. But by going through the Japanese records, a more precise date and time could be determined. The tsunami hit Japan at around midnight on January 27, 1700. The waves would have moved at a speed of about a jet plane. Scientists determined that the mysterious parent earthquake would have reached about 9 on the Richter scale and occurred at about 9 p.m. Pacific time. The discovery solved the historical mystery of the strange 1700 tsunami and proved that significant earthquakes and tsunamis could occur in the region. Many historical mysteries are small personal mysteries that may never be solved as they don't seem to have wider significance, but when they are solved, it can be even more special. In 1914, an Englishman named Percy Walsh became part of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment and traveled to the continent to fight in the Great War. He left behind a young wife and child. Percy was able to communicate with his family back home, where he had worked as a weaver at the local mill. Someone from home sent him a postcard which featured a photo of himself and some of the other soldiers. In December of 1914, all communications with Private Walsh stopped. He was classed as lost at war. Percy's wife put up an advertisement seeking information in the local paper, but what had happened to him remained a mystery. It would be 110 years before the family finally found out what had happened. Philip Cross inherited a collection of diaries and photos from his great-great-grandfather. Philip has an English father, but his mother was from Germany, as were his ancestors. Philip's great-great-grandfather, Alexander Pfeiffer, served during the First World War and wrote about his experiences. The diary showed just how horrific conditions were in the trenches and no man's land between them. Alexander also kept postcards that he found on the bodies of soldiers he came across. He recorded a little information about them and the battle they'd fought and lost their lives in. One of the items he found was Percy Walsh's postcard. Percy had lost his life defending a trench that his unit had only captured the day before. When Philip came across the postcard, he wanted to find out more about Percy. There was enough information about the battle to determine which regiments had been fighting in it. He managed to identify the Percy in the postcard as Percy Walsh and even tracked down the man's family. When Philip handed over the postcard, it solved a century-old family mystery and provided the first photo of Percy that his family had ever seen. Roman concrete is a building material that has lasted through the ages. Structures that were built thousands of years ago still stand today. Many of the wonders of ancient Rome are made of the material, including the Pantheon, which has the largest reinforced dome found anywhere in the world. For centuries, scientists have tried to solve the historical mystery of just how this material was created. We have lots of writing from ancient Rome, and writers from the time did preserve some information about the cement. Pliny the Elder, who lived in the 1st century, wrote about a material called pozzolana. It was named after a town near the Gulf of Naples, where the material was first recognized, but became so famous that any material with the same makeup earned the name. It was made from a type of volcanic ash, which had a special mineral composition. The minerals included a mix of silicon oxide and silicon aluminum oxide, which helped the material remain durable. Scientists were eventually able to crack this part of the mystery. Modern technology could chemically analyze volcanic ash from Vesuvius and other producers of pozzolana to figure out just what materials were so important to the ancient Romans. But it wasn't the entire story. Experiments with the ash produced durable concrete, but it still wasn't the same as that used by the ancient Romans. In 2023, scientists from MIT uncovered another ancient secret. For years, lime clasts had been noticed in the Roman concrete, but they were dismissed as unimportant, and it was assumed that they were accidentally produced due to poor quality control. But further investigation proved that this wasn't the case. It wasn't just the material that made Roman concrete so durable, but the method that was used to produce it. It was assumed that the lime was first added to water and then mixed with the ash and other ingredients to create the concrete. In fact, the ancient Romans used quicklime and added it directly to the ingredients before adding in water. This left behind the clasts, which were little pockets of lime dotted throughout the cement. When water is added to these clasts, they react and produce a calcium solution. When dried out, the calcium carbonate recrystallizes, and it effectively gave Roman concrete self-healing properties. Experiments using concrete with and without the clasts showed that small cracks could be mended on the clast-ridden material. Scientists hope that by solving this mystery, modern building materials can be adapted to become more durable, which would lower the amount of concrete that needs to be produced. Historians have debated for centuries the actual location of the last major battle of the First English Civil War. Excavations that took place this year may have solved the mystery. The Battle of Stow on the Wold was known to have taken place somewhere near the town of Stow in Gloucestershire. The Royalist Army commander, Sir Jacob Astley, had gone into the Midlands to round up the remaining forces there and create a new field army when it became clear help wasn't coming from abroad. But as the new army tried to return to Oxford, it was intercepted by parliamentarian forces. The Royalist army made a last stand on a hill and almost managed to escape, but in the end they were surrounded and defeated. Some managed to escape and made it back to Stow. Over 1,000 people were captured. For a long time, a hill near the village of Donington was believed to be the location of the battle. A monument was placed here, but historians doubted the conclusion. The area wasn't large enough for the battle to have taken place. It was also a good distance away from Stow. Many of the retreating royalists were captured as they tried to escape, but some managed to make it to the town that the battle was named after. That would only have been the case if the battle was closer to the town. When archaeologists explored the site where the battle supposedly took place, they could find nothing older than the 1770s. The Battle of Stow-on-the-Wold took place in 1646. There was also no sign of any musket balls or ammunition from the Civil War period. Groups dedicated to solving the mystery identified a number of other locations. A series of digs took place starting in 2015. A few items were located, but it wasn't until early 2024 that they could confirm they had found the site. In a field about a mile away from the marker, archaeologists and metal detectorists found musket balls, powder caps, and cavalry weapons that dated back to the Civil War period. The field was closer to Stow and much more suitable for the battle. Historic England is still assessing the discovery, but it seems this mystery has now been solved. A 90-year-old historical mystery was solved in February of 2022, when paleontologists took a second look at a fossil created millions of years ago. In 1931, a strange discovery was made in the Italian Alps. Embedded in rock, created 280 million years ago, was what looked like an ancient reptile. The outline of the creature was clearly visible, with a few bones sticking out. Most striking was the fact that the animal was black in color. Experts believed this was preserved soft tissue. It's incredibly rare for soft tissue to be preserved in fossils. It was believed that somehow the ancient creature had been naturally mummified, leaving behind a preserved layer of skin. The color resembled the fossilized soft tissue of plants and some animals that had already been discovered. The animal was given the name Tridentinosaurus antiquus. What made the fossil even more exciting was the age. Reptiles first emerged at the start of the Permian Age, and the date of this fossil would make it one of the oldest reptiles ever discovered. But exactly how it fits into the puzzle of evolution was a mystery. No other examples of this fossil had been found, and it remained unexplained. It was still a valuable item, and appeared in books and articles, but it wasn't until 2021 that a modern study of the fossil took place. Researchers started by using ultraviolet photography to examine the fossil. They found that it was covered in a coating. This wasn't too uncommon, as sometimes varnish was used to preserve fossils in the early days of paleontology. But when the team used other methods to try to get under the coating, they found that that wasn't what had happened. The black coloring of the fossil wasn't soft tissue. It was paint made from animal charcoal. The rock was also carved to create the outline of the fossil, so this fossil was a forgery, or at least mostly. There are still the fossilized remains of leg bones and some bony scales in the rock that appear to be genuine. Experts believe that someone may have carved out the body of a reptile to make the bones stand out more clearly, and may not have intended to mislead anyone. Even though it wasn't the fascinating specimen that it was once thought to be, the fossil could still provide insight into the distant past. First World War was the first time submarine warfare played an important factor. The German military in particular used the vessels to great effect, especially early in the war. But while the U-boats wreaked havoc on shipping in the Atlantic and Baltic Sea, not all returned home. U-26 was one of those submarines lost on patrol. The submarine was the pride of the German Navy, but its reign of terror in the Baltic Sea would be cut short in August of 1915. The U-26 never made it back to port after a patrol in the Gulf of Finland. Russia had reacted to the high number of losses in the region with mines. Mine layers had blocked access to the Gulf of Finland in the hopes that this would stop German submarines from sinking their ships. When the U-26 didn't return to port, it was assumed that she had hit one of these mines. The other possibility was a technical failure. For decades, it was believed that she had sunk somewhere in the Baltic Sea. But in 2012, a diving team in the Gulf of Finland spotted something strange on a side scanner. It looked like a sunken submarine beneath one of the busiest shipping lanes in the area. Both St. Petersburg and Helsinki sit off the Gulf, so it's not surprising that there's a lot of traffic in the region. A coordinated effort to manage traffic was needed for the dive team to check out the wreck. It was worth the effort, though. After diving down to the sea floor, they were able to confirm this was the missing submarine. She'd been hit by a mine, presumably while trying to get out of the Gulf after a patrol, rather than trying to get in. Even 100 years later, the wreck was in good condition, and described as the best preserved wreck of a World War I U-boat in the world. It was 1942, just months after the traumatic damages that the Japanese had inflicted upon America. The aftermath of the Second World War brought nothing more than anger to everyone in the stateside. They sought retribution. Some residents, though seemingly unaffected, continued with their daily lives. One such person was Velva Dixon, who ran her ordinary-looking doll shop on 714 Madison Avenue in New York City. Velva life was rich in history. She graduated from Stanford University, but didn't receive her Bachelor of Arts degree until many years later, because she had not returned a few books that she had lent from the university. In the mid-20s, she was employed at a bank in San Francisco, which was owned by her husband, Lee. In 1937, the couple opted to move to New York City, where Velva would secure employment as a saleswoman for a doll store. She would later begin operating her own doll store, initially at 680 Madison Avenue, before relocating to 714 Madison Avenue. It was this doll shop that found itself stuck in a historical image. Here, Velva catered to wealthy collectors and hobbyists who were interested in antique, foreign, and regional dolls. Lee handled the accounting records for his wife, and everything seemed to be going just well. But then in February of 1942, something caught the attention of the FBI. Wartime censors intercepted a letter talking about dolls due to their unusual contents. The letter supposedly came from a woman who lived in Portland, Oregon, and was making its way to someone in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The letter spoke of a doll hospital, and the writer's 3 Old English dolls that were sent for repairs. The words fishnets and balloons also made their way into the note. The intercepted letter was sent to cryptographers in the FBI laboratory. They found that the 3 Old English dolls may be referring to 3 warships, and the doll hospital was a shipyard where repairs were undertaken. The experts also deduced that the fishing nets were referring to submarine nets that protected ports on the West Coast, and the mention of balloons was cited as an intention to convey information about defense installations on the West Coast. After decrypting the letter, the FBI began to investigate to determine if the information was referring to United States defense matters, and if they were being transmitted to the opposing force. In the interim, another 4 letters were intercepted. They were addressed to the same individual with the notation "address unknown." The 4 persons whose names appeared on the letters were questioned. It was determined that the contents were accurate to their personal lives, interest in dolls, signatures, and names, but they denied ever sending the letters. One of the 4 letters also referred to the words "destroyed your" and the sentence "Mr. Shaw is ill and will be back to work soon." It became clear that this was in reference to the ship Destroyer Shaw, which had its bow blown off during the Pearl Harbor attack. It was being repaired at the shipyard of the West Coast and would be rejoining the fleet. Further investigation also revealed that the signatures that appeared on these letters were not authentic, but forgeries, which meant that the original signatures of each of these individuals, who shared a common interest in doll collection, were in the possession of the forger. One of the supposed letter writers who denied writing them directed the FBI to a New York City doll shop owned by the aforementioned Velva Dickinson. An investigation found that it was her typewriter that was responsible for at least one of these letters, and that each of the 4 women's signatures corresponded with doll collections at the doll shop. The FBI also found something rather alarming. In the early to mid-1930s, Velva was part of the Japan-American Society, and she had made frequent visits to the Japanese consulate in San Francisco. She also went to important social gatherings attended by Japanese Navy members. Velva also visited the Nippon Club and Japanese Institute, where she cultivated a friendship with the Japanese Consul General and met with the Japanese naval attaché, Ichiro Yokoyama. It became clear quite quickly that this was a case of espionage, all of which was carried out from the front of an innocent-looking doll shop in New York City. Velvalee was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law, which was 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Still, she maintained that it was her now deceased husband who was the traitor and not her. The letters were just too odd to be just about antiques and collections. Velvalee was named the spy in the doll shop. This gaping mouth belonged to a sinister spectacle in Paris's Belle Époque. It was the Cabaret of Hell. The entity that marks the entrance is the jaws of a leviathan, the symbol of damnation. It was established in 1892 and stood as a unique feature. It wasn't just an iconic entertainment venue, but also the portal to the city's underbelly, with the fantastical and forbidden coming together. The Cabaret of Hell was established as a counterpart to the Cabaret of the Sky, which shared the same address. The man who created, directed, and hosted the twin enterprises was Antonin Alexander. The club was nothing less than eccentric. It attracted many onlookers, macabre lovers, and opposing forces. At the door stood a doorman dressed as Satan, who greeted customers with "Enter and be damned." Inside, patrons were served by waiters who were also dressed as devilish entities. The terminology within the establishment also coincided with the theme. If one wanted 3 black coffees spiked with cognac, they had to relay this to the bar as 3 seeping bumpers of molten sins and a dash of brimstone intensifier. The true essence of the cabaret lay in the exciting performances of singers, dancers, and other entertainers. They adorned costumes that were reminiscent of damnation and temptation. It was a true spectacle. The onstage performances went from sensual to incredibly grotesque, where the narratives balanced on the edge of social acceptance. The audience was a mix of travelers and locals who chose to revel in the scandalous nature that the establishment exuded. The entranceway of the Cabaret of Hell was not the only haunting design that the club took on. Inside, the ceilings were alive with creatures and entities of the underworld that greeted the patrons with outstretched claws and grim faces. Later, a competitor opened up called Cabaret of the Void, which specialized in the invocations of what may lie beyond the grave. The Cabaret of Heaven proposed mystical illusions, and the Cabaret of Hell was the club of magic tricks and the macabre. After the liberation of Paris, a supermarket that neighbored the establishments bought both of the counterparts, stripped them of their embellishments, and expanded them. By 1950, though, all traces of the portal to the underbelly were gone, and its existence was only confirmed through the remaining pictures and archival material. While this may look like an image taken from a science fiction film, it was a real event. This historical photograph was taken in October of 1930, when 54 people were boarding the HMA R101, a British airship. The story of R101, though, begins in the No. 1 shed in the summer of 1930. It had been undergoing extensive modifications, which were needed after the blimp's previous trial flights. R101 and its counterpart R100 were known to lack the disposable lift that had been planned for the Imperial airship scheme of 1925. Those who were involved in the scheme discovered that both airships were not viable for commercial operation. The intentions were then passed to the newer ship, R102. The modifications to R101 to achieve the lift were a central bay and a gas bag. In September of 1930, the blimp was gassed and set afloat right in the shed. The ship was due to leave for Karachi later that month, when it would be carrying the Air Minister Lord Thompson of Cardington. The target date of this trip was on course, only for the wind to prevent R101 from leaving the shed until the morning of the 1st of October. At 6:30 a.m. that day, the blimp emerged from the shed and serenely made its way to the mast. By 4:30 that afternoon, the ship had slipped its mast and left Cardington. It headed south to London and turned east to follow the Thames to Essex, spending the night over the North Sea. A day later, it returned to its bay in Cardington after having spent over 17 hours in the air in smooth flying conditions. That evening, a conference was held to determine whether or not R101 should make the trip to India. It was determined that the new modifications had not taken the engines into consideration, and that allowing the ship to fly at full speed may result in failure. The maximum recommended speed at this point was cruising speed. Pressure mounted with the involvement of R101 after the Air Minister stated that he needed to go to India and back in time for the Imperial Conference that would take place on the 20th of October. And so the decision was made to let R101 embark on the India flight. Final preparations were being made, and the ship remained at the mast while the crew prepared themselves. A meteorologist, Giblet, was watching the weather forecast, ensuring that the conditions would be optimal for that day. But on the day that it was due to take flight, conditions over northern France were looking cloudy. On the 4th of October, R101 was due to take flight between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. By this time, wind conditions had increased drastically, and it was decided that the trip should be hurried along. And so, as pictured here, passengers began to board at 6:24 that afternoon, in the midst of rain and darkness. The ship began to cruise and headed past the shed it was once stored in. It headed west, saluting its hometown. It then headed southeast towards London, cruising at 1,500 feet high below the cloud base. By 8 p.m. that evening, R101 was making its way over London. When that picture was taken on the 4th of October in 1930, no one knew that this would be the ship's final voyage. Just past midnight, the blimp sent the following message, reading 2400 GMT, 15 miles southwest of Abbeville, speed 33 knots, wind 243 degrees 35 miles per hour. The message ended with, "Crew have settled down to watchkeeping routine." This would be the last message sent by the airship. At 2 a.m., it reached Beauvais and was spotted by witnesses struggling against the rolling winds. Its nose then pointed down, and it made a long and steep dive toward the ground. The dive was sufficient enough to cause engineers to lose balance, and for furniture from the smoking room to slide around. As the nose touched the ground, the now hot engine made contact with free gas from the most forward gas bags that had been recently installed. Flames consumed R101, reducing it to nothing more than an empty frame. Remaining as a haunting echo was this photograph of the boarding and final voyage of the HMA R101 before it met its destructive demise, with only a handful of survivors. The skewed window frames, decrepit shutters, and flaking roofs are not the aftermath of an earthquake or an abandoned town. In fact, 5 Points of New York City was bustling, but not in the way that one would hope. It was this place that was New York's most notorious urban neighborhood, teeming with crime, corruption, and poverty, and for many, heading to New York City was a dream come true. It offered residents the world's most supreme facilities, including theaters, restaurants, and gyms. Yet one place in Lower Manhattan served as an eyesore, contrasted against the prosperous Big Apple. It was the 19th century, a time in which 5 Points was poverty-stricken. The neighborhood was named for the intersection of 5 streets: Little Water, Orange, Mulberry, Cross, and Anthony. It was an appalling place to be, riddled with unsanitary conditions and high crime rates. Despite this, it does hold important significance for American history due to immigration, social challenges, culture, crime, and politics. 5 Points was the perfect example of the challenges that urban immigration was facing at the time. This image is reminiscent of the harsh realities of such a life. The crimes were so dreadful that they shaped most of American law practices today. 5 Points gained notoriety in the early 19th century. It was known for the squalid living conditions amidst the crime that took place there. Its origins were traced to the Collect Pond. After being polluted with industrial waste, the pond was filled in to create buildable land, which became 5 Points. Building over the polluted pond contributed to the disease-ridden conditions. Irish and Italian immigrants flocked to the area due to its affordability. It didn't take long for it to become the center of social vices and overcrowding. The affordability allowed low-income residents to live in the small, cramped apartments, which contributed to the overcrowding and worsening conditions. Typhus and cholera broke out in the neighborhood due to improper sewage systems. Initially, the area boasted vibrancy with music and dance, but soon gained its reputation as the dangerous slum of New York City. The area would also find itself ruled by self-proclaimed individuals such as John Morrissey. Morrissey was a member of the 5 Points Gang, who earned his fame as a bare-knuckle boxer. Shockingly, he would later become a Democratic Party politician. Paul Kelly was another prominent gangster who founded the 5 Points Gang. He was one of the most powerful criminals in New York City. It was his gang that produced the mafia leaders Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. William Poole, known as Bill the Butcher, was another popular leader. He founded and led the Bowery Boys, a gang that was the center of infamous activities like frequent violent confrontations with rivals and warfare. This neighborhood was named the place where the gangs lived, and included other notorious groups such as the 40 Thieves, the Daybreak Boys, and the Eastman Coin Collectors, among others. One famous man, Charles Dickens, was there to see it all. In his writings of first-hand accounts, he described what he saw. These descriptions include the pitch-dark stairs, trembling boards, and a wolfish den. He recounted that no ray of light or breath of air dares to enter the neighborhood. He spoke of ruined houses, wide gaps in the walls, and the world of vice and misery. Dickens had insisted on visiting 5 Points during a tour of America due to its mythical status at the time. The vintage photograph of the neighborhood encapsulated his words without fault. While she may look as though she's in pain or uncomfortable, actress Lois Collier isn't really trying on the Spanish boot. Her foot is merely slipped into a non-torturous replica. Lois was an American actress who played the role of Joanne Fletcher in Jungle Woman, a 1944 Reginald LeBorg film. It isn't the history of Lois that this photograph concerns though, but rather the replica that she finds her foot in. The Spanish boot was one horrific torture device and is known as the worst type of punishment in the history of humankind. It was used for punishment as well as interrogation. Many Spanish boots have come into existence, and there are different methods of pain infliction. Most of them were designed to crush, or at the very least, severely injure the wearer's foot or leg. One such boot would be made of wooden boards nailed together. They were specifically made to fit the individual who would wear them. Once the leg was enclosed between the boards, wedges would be hammered in to create an increase in pressure. This would continuously be tightened until the victim either confessed to a crime, gave crucial information, or lost consciousness. The newer variants included iron vices, much like the one that Lois wore. Sometimes they'd be armed with spikes that squeezed the appendage and created suffering for the wearer. One of the accounts of the boot torture device being used on a person dates back to 1668. Archbishop James Sharp was in a coach in Edinburgh when a man named James Mitchell approached the carriage and attacked Sharp. The bishop luckily survived, and the hunt for the assassin commenced. Mitchell wasn't captured until 1674 and was taken to a dungeon off the Scottish mainland. There, he was told that if he confessed to the attempted assassination, then his life would be spared. So in front of the court, the assassin confessed to the crime, only to find out that no one actually confirmed that they would spare his life. Mitchell then recanted his confession, which led him to being affixed with the Scottish boot, the Scottish version of the Spanish boot, that entailed the same sort of method with wedges and increasing pressure. He later wrote that it was an extreme inquiry of torture. He wrote at length about the torture that he endured, which happened on various occasions. Despite this, he never confessed to the assassination again. There existed various other methods of interrogation that made use of a boot, one of which placed the victim's legs inside a pair of boots that were then held above a flame or placed within a pair that was topped with scorching hot water or oil. Featuring in the image with Lois is a type of torture boot that was employed by the Spanish boot as well. This one, though, was attached to a crank, which when turned compressed the shackled foot, causing a crushing pressure, sometimes with spikes adorning the inner sole. Pictured here are the Rollins Juniors, a baseball team that played and lost 4 times against the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars, the worst ball club that was ever established. This picture is particularly haunting, given the makeup of the opposing team. The Wyoming team was made up of criminals who were on the execution list. They were incarcerated for various crimes, including homicide and burglary. This image was produced in 1911, a time in which execution was still being used for higher-ranking criminals. But as long as the prisoners kept winning, the longer they got to evade the gallows. The All-Stars team looked like any other. They took team photographs decked out in uniforms with matching caps and gloves. The lineup consisted of a man convicted of homicide who was at the shortstop. A burglar was at the third stop, and Manning at first base was a man convicted of a harsher felony. Each individual, though, showed some aptitude for sport, hence their recruitment. On its surface, this new program was installed by a new warden who had a keen interest in the game. But beneath that surface was corruption at its finest. The story of the controversial baseball team began during a time when the sport was sweeping across America. In Wyoming, several semi-pro and amateur teams began to pop up, and fans just couldn't get enough of it. The Wyoming State Penitentiary was established in 1901 in Rawlings. It was a gloomy lockup with no electricity or running water. It was a cold and miserable place for anyone to be incarcerated. Making matters worse was that Otto Graham, a millionaire businessman, was running it with the assistance of the then warden J.P. Hen. Initially, the inmates were set to manufacture brooms for Graham in a makeshift factory for 57 cents a day. Prisoners were kept half alive with mistreatment and starvation. After more than a decade, Governor Joseph Carey shut the whole place down and tapped County Sheriff Felix Alston as the new warden. Alston was the man with the baseball obsession, who certainly instilled the change that the governor was opting for. In this case, it was the institution's first ever baseball team. While the warden's intentions were mostly good in the hopes of boosting the spirits of the inmates and building morale, he didn't take something into account. The team was dangerous. Inmates ranged from ages 18 to 39, and the roster was fleshed from the likes of Joe Gazzardo, convicted of manslaughter, Eugene Rowan, convicted of assault, John Crotty, who found himself in prison for grand larceny, Sidney Potter, a forger, Frank Fitzgerald, who was convicted of breaking and entering, and Joseph Sang, incarcerated for homicide in the first degree. The pitcher was a man named Thomas Cameron, a 20-year-old coal miner with a rap sheet that included assaults of various types. The coach was George Saban, a man convicted of manslaughter. He was doing a 25-year stint for taking the life of a sheep herder using a firearm and setting another two individuals alight amid the Spring Creek raid. Despite how terrible the makeup of the All-Stars was, they were fairly good baseball players. In 1911, Daniel Kenneman, the owner of the Wyoming Supply Company, suggested that the convicts play a series against the Rawlins Juniors. Their first game commenced on the 18th of July in 1911, the day that Sang would be granted a stay of execution. The convicts defeated the Juniors that day at a score of 11-1. All in all, the All-Stars won 4 matches against the Juniors. Forcing inmates to play baseball in exchange for their lives wasn't the only issue in this program, though. The convict-filled sport was also fed a local interest, such as gambling. Later that year, heavier restrictions would be placed on the prison after a rash of escapes occurred that year. The Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars faded from existence. As for Sang, it turned out that his stay had been arranged by attorneys and was short-lived. He was to meet the gallows the following year, during which the Cabron County Journal noted that his steps were steady and he accepted his execution in such a manner that he was stamped a brave man. While this may look like an innocent photograph of an unknown individual's fingers, the story behind it is nothing short of shocking. It begins with a man born to the name Alvin Francis Karpovich, better known as Alvin Karpis. He was also nicknamed Creepy due to his haunting and sinister smile. Karpis was an American criminal who was prominent in the 1930s. He was deemed an enemy of the public and known for his alliance with the Barker Gang. This alliance became known as the Karpis-Barker Gang, which was one of the most formidable criminal organizations of its time. They exhibited no hesitation to take anyone's life, even that of innocent onlookers. They robbed numerous banks, hijacked deliveries, and turned to the works of kidnapping. In 1933, the group abducted a millionaire Minnesota man named William Ham. The ransom was a hefty $100,000. The kidnapping of Minnesota banker Edward Bremer Jr. brought them another $200,000. The group was led by Karpis, who had a photographic memory. The gang consisted of at least another 25 members. The FBI began hunting down this public enemy, tracking him down to Atlantic City in 1935. It was here that he almost met his violent demise, yet managed to escape. Karpis continued to commit his crimes and even pulled off a train robbery in Ohio, netting another $27,000. It wasn't this gangster's business dealings that made the images of his fingertips alarming, but rather what happened to those fingers amid the 1930s. During the era of gangs and outlaws, another underground business came into play. It was the plastic surgery of the underworld, which offered various modifications to these outlaws in an effort to protect them against law enforcement. This is precisely what happened to Karpis's fingers. The crime boss and Fred Barker, who was part of the Barker gang, sought the assistance of Joseph Moran. He was known to stitch up mobsters and remove shrapnel following encounters with the police. Moran happily performed the fingerprint mutilation on the two in order to make identification a lot more difficult, especially at the crime scenes that trailed behind them and the scenes that were yet to come. But this mutilation didn't come without a painful cost. Often, it would entail a nasty method, such as sanding down, slicing, or using acid to burn the prints away. The image seen here is Alvin Karpis's altered fingerprints, which the FBI photographed upon his arrest just 1 year later in New Orleans. Alarmingly, this sort of practice is still going on even today. Serving as a stark contrast against this small town is a mysterious object jutting from the open ocean waters. It jumps from the waters of Port Saul Rocks, 2 kilometers from the coast of Brittany, France. It's the shipwreck of an oil tanker, Amoco Cadiz, and it's been protruding from the sea since 1978, where it remains today in a state of rust and decay. It was the 16th of March, 1978, when the oil tanker, owned by Amoco Transport Corp., when built in Spain, was on a voyage manned by an Italian crew. The vessel was Liberia registered, and in its belly, Amoco Cadiz held 223,000 tons of crude oil, as well as another 4,000 tons of bunker fuel. During the vessel's journey, the steering mechanism failed. It was never determined if there was an inadequate backup steering in place, or if the crew were just unsuccessful or untrained in their emergency backup controls. Upon the steering failure, though, Amoco Cadiz did receive help, but it came in the form of just one singular tugboat. The tug was called the Pacific, and its owners, as well as Amoco Cadiz's owners, wasted crucial time by haggling over the salvage contract. By the time the rescue attempt went into operation, it was too little too late. The Pacific headed out to the oil tanker and began tugging it to the shore. But this effort proved futile, given that the roughness of the waves had picked up by this point, resulting in the tow line snapping. By then, the ship was already out of the traffic lanes and making its way into French territory. As it made its way into the waters, the ship ran aground on Port Saul Rock, on the Breton coast, where it began to sink. The story should end there, with the ship sinking and tons of crude oil still concealed within. But instead, the French Navy decided that they didn't want this foreign vessel stationed in their waters, especially when small amounts of oil began to release. Instead of pumping the oil from the tanker, the Navy made use of depth charges to destroy the wreckage, causing it to break apart into 3 sections right in the English Channel, releasing 223,000 tons of crude oil all at once. This resulted in the largest oil spill ever known to mankind. The local politicians demanded immediate action to contain the disaster, but cleanup efforts were incredibly uncoordinated. Adding to the complications was the fact that the technology for oil cleanups wasn't very advanced at this point, and even with the experts at the front of the operation, attempting to contain the oil would be futile. Prior to the 1978 incident, the Torrey Canyon oil spill claimed the title of the worst environmental tanker disaster, which turned the sea black in 1967. The Amoco Cadiz oil tanker now holds the title for the world's worst maritime oil spill, which placed a darker mark on the environmental record of shipping. After the wreck, the French government opted to move the lanes away from the coast, and ships in trouble were required to notify the French Navy immediately, but the damage was already done. Amoco Cadiz now strikes from the sea as a shocking reminder of the worst environmental catastrophe and the largest loss of marine life in history. Teddy Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States and served from 1901 to 1909. While he showed interest in many sports and outdoor activities, he took a keen interest in hunting. Roosevelt was passionate about it. He enjoyed the thrill of tracking and chasing animals down before using his skilled marksmanship, bringing the chase to a violent end. During one long hunting trip in 1902 in Mississippi, the president was in search of a bear to hunt. But it was unproductive, and the group wasn't having much success. This prompted a guide to track down a bear and tie it to a tree, just so that Roosevelt would be able to capture something. The creature was old and injured, which allowed the guide to capture it with ease. Despite having taken the lives of countless animals prior, Roosevelt refused to do it. It was unsportsmanlike, according to him. This sudden change of outlook revered the president as a hero, even though the suffering bear's life had to be humanely ended anyway. News of this event spread quickly and captured the likes of Clifford Berryman, a cartoonist, who satirized the event in a cartoon. The drawing appeared in the Washington Post in November. A man named Morris Measham saw the satirical cartoon and decided to create a toy dedicated to the refusal to end the bear's life. It was called the Teddy Bear. But the odes to Roosevelt's heroic decision didn't end there. The next creation, pictured here, took on more of a creepy sight. It took the form of a silent film called The Teddy Bears, which was produced in 1907. The film is just 13 minutes long and centers around the tale of Goldilocks and the three bears. The film starts in reference to the fairy tale of Goldilocks, but ends with the political satire of the president. After Goldilocks invades the home of the three bears, she flees to the safety of Theodore Roosevelt, who then fires at the two adult bears. When Baby Bear came running along, he opted not to fire at him, and instead tied him up and led him to a house filled with stuffed teddy bears, which each of the three characters took and headed off with. This image was taken from the silent film, a time when costume making was in its youth. This made for a creepy image of oddly faced and upright bears lingering over Goldilocks, turning the children's story into a horror. The 22nd of November, 1963, was a day that shook the world. It was an event that was felt around the world, with many nations sharing America's grief. It was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It was in the midst of the Cold War when the president and his wife rode in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. The accused assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who embraced Marxism. Oswald, though, never stood trial because his life was taken while he was being transferred by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, who was absolutely distraught. He wasn't the only person affected by the ordeal. One image managed to encapsulate the feelings that traveled across the world, and news began to spread. The picture came from New York, and it was that of an unnamed woman's face, marred by pure shock and horror as she learned of the JFK assassination. Crowds began to gather in public places, while many openly wept. Traffic came to a halt as the news jumped from car to car. Schools all across the United States were dismissed early. The major television networks suspended their schedules and switched to news coverage. Each network was on air for 70 hours straight, which made it the longest uninterrupted news event in the United States. Stress was at an all-time high, since this event took place amid the Cold War. The nation felt as though they were balancing on the edge of a larger attack on the United States, and wondered if the assassination was just the beginning of it. In Germany, Lucien Heischler got news of the assassination while attending the return of a Fulbright student, and the cultural affairs officer gave a reception. In a matter of minutes, Berlin broke up. Theaters closed along with bars, restaurants, and movie houses. It was quiet and desolate. Heischler headed to a bunker room that was used for emergencies, and there he and military colleagues spent the night discussing protocol matters, occupying their minds. Africa was affected by the ordeal as well. William Roundtree from Sudan commented that the country felt a personal loss. Before the passing of JFK was confirmed, Sudanese people arrived at the chancery door, expressing their condolences through tears. In a matter of hours, every taxi would be traveling with a black banner attached to their radio aerial. It became evident that they had felt the loss of the president quite deeply. News arrived in Austria, France, the Netherlands, the USSR, Asia, Yemen, Japan, and Latin America. The world was in a state of fear, sadness, and shock. Many slumped in their seats in defeat. Others gathered and cried, and it was chaos. And that chaos and emotion could all be seen in the face of a stranger wandering the streets, newspaper clutched to her chest. Many of us hold cherished memories of reading the book The Little Prince, or having it read to us by a parent or guardian. Many people don't realize that behind one of the world's most infamous books is a historical mystery that has spanned decades and has only recently been solved. The Little Prince was first published in 1943 and written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. At the outbreak of World War II, Saint-Exupéry utilized his previous aviation experience and decided to join the French Air Force in their efforts to fight off the impending German invasion. This wasn't a decision that he took lightly, and knew that it was his duty to dedicate himself to the French resistance and play his part in stopping the Axis forces. During his time in the Air Force, Saint-Exupéry wrote The Little Prince, along with many other books and short stories. These provided him with a sense of comfort and hope, reminding him that despite the dark times he was living in, happiness was just around the corner. Little did Saint-Exupéry know that his book would go on to provide millions of people around the world with the same happiness he felt while writing it. Then, in 1944, Saint-Exupéry mysteriously vanished without a trace while he was out performing a reconnaissance mission. Everyone in his squadron was devastated when they returned to their base, only to find an empty spot where Saint-Exupéry's plane should have been. The Air Force searched day and night for the missing pilot. However, all they found was an unidentified body wearing a uniform. Everyone believed they had just found the remains of Saint-Exupéry, and he was buried days later. But that still left the mystery of what had happened on that fateful day in 1944. It wouldn't be until 2004 that this decades-old mystery would finally be laid to rest. French scuba diving teams came across the remnants of a P-38 plane deep in the Mediterranean Sea. The team knew that they'd made the discovery of a lifetime, and it wasn't until they cross-referenced serial numbers with historical records that they realized they'd found the missing plane of Saint-Exupéry. Following this baffling discovery, a German soldier came forward and claimed responsibility for Saint-Exupéry's demise, telling authorities that he had shot down his plane sometime in 1944. However, the evidence recovered from Saint-Exupéry's plane does not match up with this account, and it's now widely accepted that he perished at sea. Marcellin and Francine Dumoulin lived a simple life in the village of Chandolin in Switzerland. After getting married, the couple went on to have 7 children. Marcellin worked as a shoemaker, while Francine worked as a school teacher in a small village to help provide for the family. Not much else is known about the family's life, with most news articles writing that they lived a relatively calm and peaceful existence. That all changed on August 15, 1942, when the 40-year-old Marcellin and 37-year-old Francine left the family home to go and milk their cows. According to their eldest daughter, Monique, quote, "My father hugged me and promised he'd return later that evening after tending to the cows." Sadly, as the hours passed and the skies darkened, there was no sign of Marcellin and Francine Dumoulin. As morning broke, Monique knew that something was terribly wrong and ran over to a neighbor's house to ask if they had seen her parents. Monique was horrified to hear that her neighbors hadn't seen them, telling the Daily Mail, quote, "When she said she hadn't, I started crying. I knew it was bad." A search was launched by the priest, a friend of my father. The whole village helped, but there was no sign, no clues. Days turned into weeks, and soon the Dumoulin children realized that their parents were never coming home. They were sent to live with different families throughout the village, but they were left wondering what had happened to their parents. Then in July of 2017, the Dumoulin children received the shock of their lives when investigators confirmed that the decades-old mystery had been solved. Investigators confirmed that they had found the frozen bodies of their parents in a nearby glacier. They also confirmed that their bodies had been perfectly preserved after being frozen for decades. They were able to obtain DNA samples, which, when compared to their surviving children, produced a match. They also found personal belongings at the scene, which bore the names Marcellin and Francine. It's believed that the couple fell into a crevice where they laid unidentified for decades. After their bodies were discovered, investigators worked with the children to arrange a funeral, and Marcellin and Francine were buried together in a joint service at the local church. The Dumoulin children are grateful that their decades-long mystery was finally resolved and they were able to say goodbye. Those who went to school in North America, you may be familiar with the USS Indianapolis and the disturbing mystery that will haunt the ship for many years. The USS Indianapolis and the crew played a key part in World War II, and in July of 1945, they would unknowingly embark on their final mission to the Pacific island of Tinian. The US government had chosen the USS Indianapolis and the crew to embark on the mission that would almost guarantee the end of the war. Their mission was to deliver components and parts for the first atomic bomb, which later became known as Little Boy. The first part of their trip went without incident, and the parts were delivered to the American soldiers and scientists waiting for them. Just a week after this delivery, Little Boy was dropped on Japan and completely changed World War II forever. It wasn't until the USS Indianapolis was making its return journey that they were attacked. The ship and the 1,197 men aboard were sailing through the Philippines when they were ambushed by Japanese submarines. One survivor recalled, quote, "Womb, up in the air I went. There was water, debris, fire, everything just coming up, and we were about 25 meters from the waterline. It was a tremendous explosion. Then, about the time I got to my knees, another one hit. Womb." In total, there were 2 torpedoes fired at the USS Indianapolis, and within 12 minutes the ship had completely sunk. Multiple SOS messages were broadcasted in the ensuing chaos. However, no one came forward to rescue them, and the US Navy brushed the SOS messages off as a hoax. For 4 days, small pockets of survivors clung to whatever debris they could find, and then on the 4th day, a miracle happened. A Navy plane was flying overhead and spotted the men. From there, a recovery mission was launched, and the remaining survivors were taken to dry land. The US Navy were keen to cover up their shortcomings and began pinning the blame onto the ship's captain. They showed little interest in finding the USS Indianapolis or offering support to the 317 men who survived. After that, the ship faded from the minds of the US Navy, but not from the minds of the general public. Years after the incident, the ship began making its way into the spotlight again thanks to the movie Jaws. While there was a renewed interest in the USS Indianapolis and its crew, historians had no idea where the ship was and set out on a quest to find it. It wasn't until 2017, when Paul Allen funded an expedition to find the missing ship, that the historical mystery was finally cracked. Allen was inspired to help find the USS Indianapolis after a historian discovered records of the ship's exact whereabouts in the hours before the tragedy. 5,500 meters below the surface of the Philippine Sea, Allen's crew made a startling discovery. After utilizing sonar technology, topographical data, and historical records, they'd finally found the ship. In a press conference, Allen said, quote, "Because this is a war grave and property of the US Navy, the specific location is only provided to the US Navy for them to administrate." There have been no further details released in regards to the ship, but after 72 years, the mystery has finally been solved. For years, the mystery of the Blood Falls in Antarctica has baffled scientists and the general public. The mystifying falls were first discovered by Griffith Taylor in 1911, during what is believed to be one of the earliest Antarctic explorations. Taylor and his group of scientists were perplexed by the falls and dedicated their time to finding it. They hypothesized that red algae in the water was responsible for turning the water a blood red color, but it turns out they were completely wrong. For over a century, Other scientists picked up where Taylor left off and examined the falls, but were unable to come to a solid conclusion. The general public began speculating that the blood falls were somehow tied to aliens or something otherworldly, and bizarre conspiracy theories began popping up. It wasn't until 2017 that the truth behind the blood falls was finally uncovered. A team of researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks decided to try and put an end to the mystery once and for all. The team wrote a paper that has since been published in the Journal of Glaciology and explained that the blood-red color of the falls is caused by the Taylor Glacier. The Taylor Glacier feeds into the blood falls, which is packed with iron. Once the brine salt water of the Taylor Glacier meets the iron, it oxidizes and creates the deep red color that we're seeing cascading down the falls. In 1979, a family was out searching for arrowheads in Buffalo Cave, Idaho, when they came across a strange burlap sack deep in the cave. Upon opening it up, they found a headless torso. They immediately called the authorities and an investigation was opened. Then in 1991, a hand, an arm, and legs of the body were discovered in the cave, and forensic experts began their analysis. The experts were able to determine that the body was that of an adult male of European descent and between the ages of 30 and 40. However, without the man's head present, identification proved almost impossible. As the man had been wrapped in a burlap sack and placed in the cave, his remains had been extremely well preserved, and his post-mortem interval was listed as 5 months to 6 years. Despite their best efforts, authorities in Idaho failed to identify the unknown man, and he simply became known as the Buffalo Cave John Doe. Those closest to the case never gave up hope that one day he would finally get his name back. Then in 2019, the Idaho State University reached out to DNA Doe, who provided forensic genealogical services to police forces across the US. With the use of forensic genealogy and family trees, the DNA Doe Project were able to track down members of the Buffalo Cave John Doe's family, who agreed to take a DNA test for comparison. After months of testing and waiting for the results, they finally had their answers. John Doe had formerly been identified as Joseph Henry Loveless of Payson, Utah. Loveless was born on December 3, 1870, and had spent the latter years of his life running from the law. According to historical records, Loveless was accused of murdering his wife, Agnes, and was swiftly arrested. However, just days after being found guilty, he broke out of his prison cell and became a fugitive of the law. Loveless is now officially the oldest John Doe to have ever been identified. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.